For many fans, the Beatles Anthology feels definitive, a sweeping monument to a band that didn't just shape pop culture, they detonated it. When the surviving Beatles told their own story, millions believed the record was set straight once and for all. But legacy is a fragile thing, and history told by its heroes is rarely complete. In the world of myth-making, silence can be as powerful as confession. The anthology gave us unprecedented access, yes. It offered archival footage, personal reflections, and intimate insights. But it was also curated, selective, gentle where reality was sharp, sanitized where truth was jagged. And it makes sense. Legends don't build themselves by exposing every fracture. They frame the light carefully, leaving the darker rooms unvisited. That's not deception. It's human. When lives become myth, self-protection and legacy preservation become instinctive. But to understand the Beatles fully, we must acknowledge what the anthology didn't reveal. The roads it didn't walk, the voices it softened, the moments where history bent beneath memory and sentiment. This isn't a takedown. It's a magnifying glass held to the spaces between what was said and what was left unsaid. A chance to revisit familiar moments not through nostalgia, but through clarity. And once we step away from the polished narrative, something remarkable appears. Not a diminished band, but a more human one. More complex, more conflicted, more real. To understand why the Beatles changed the world, we can't only celebrate the legend. We have to examine the friction, the fear, the ambition, and the pressure that shaped them. And to do that, we start where the anthology softened the edges the most, before fame made them gods, when they were still raw, hungry, and vulnerable. Because the truth about the Beatles isn't just in what the world saw, it's in what the anthology couldn't bring itself to say. The Beatles' origin story in anthology feels almost folklore-like. Four ambitious young men, bound by fate, rising from Liverpool's grit to global glory. It's charming, inspiring, and incomplete. Liverpool wasn't just a backdrop for talent to bloom, it was a crucible. The city in the 1950s and early 60s was scarred by poverty, shaped by post-war trauma, and pulsing with cultural mixing. Opportunity didn't float to the surface, it had to be clawed from hard floors. The band's early world wasn't romantic in the way the documentary implies. It was loud dance halls, restless youth energy, ego collisions, and promise mixed with risk. Hamburg? The anthology frames it as a growth chapter, packed with late nights and long gigs. Reality lived closer to survival trial. Nights spent performing until exhaustion blurred the edges of consciousness. Tight quarters, barely legal work arrangements, living conditions that weren't just rough, sometimes they were degrading. Discipline came not from inspiration alone, but necessity. To stay in Hamburg meant to harden, to adapt, to compete, and sometimes to sacrifice dignity. Even the Decca rejection, treated humorously in the anthology, carried emotional weight. It didn't simply motivate them, it shook them. For a moment, the future hovered, uncertain, fragile. That vulnerability rarely surfaces in the documentary. Instead, we see retrospective confidence, as if destiny had always been certain. It wasn't. And lineup changes, speed brushed in anthology, but replacing people, especially those who shared the early trenches, wasn't painless. Aspiration pushed them forward, but ambition also cuts. And friendships strained beneath decisions made in the name of progress. The early Beatles weren't gentle dreamers. They were fighters. Street smart, competitive, sometimes ruthless, always determined. Anthology gave us the triumph. The truth includes the hunger, the uncertainty, and the moments that nearly broke them before fame ever could. Because once the crowds arrived, the pressure multiplied, not relieved. Anthology portrays Beatlemania as a phenomenon of joy and chaos, the world erupting in admiration and excitement, the crowds, the laughter, the spontaneous charm. But what looks like exhilaration from the outside often feels like erosion from within. Global fame at that magnitude isn't a dream, it's a psychological event. Yes, the band enjoyed the thrill, but the anthology's nostalgic lens softens the suffocation, the disorientation, the creeping loss of privacy and identity. They didn't merely gain fame, they surrendered autonomy. Ordinary routines, walking outside, speaking freely, maintaining personal relationships, disappeared almost overnight. And inside the band, something subtle began shifting. Humor and camaraderie still thrive publicly, but pressure chipped at emotional foundations. Friendships changed when each day became performance, when applause drowned out quiet moments, when each member wrestled privately with what the world expected him to be. The anthology barely grazes the family impact either. Loved ones saw them vanish into hotel rooms, airplanes, and headlines. Some relationships strained to points they couldn't return from. Ringo once hinted that family looked at him differently, like he belonged to the world now, not to them. That's not glamour. That's isolation disguised as success. Even physically, the machine wore them down. Constant travel, little rest, diets of adrenaline and whatever food arrived between appearances. Fame fed them opportunities and drained stability at the same time. Anthology frames this chapter as whirlwind magic. But the truth? Beatlemania built them and began breaking them simultaneously. The cracks didn't start later. They began here, under the roar of applause. And when the noise finally forced them off the stage, they ran not toward peace, but into another battlefield, the studio, where creativity met control and unity faced its first serious test. Anthology celebrates the creative explosion of the mid-1960s brilliantly. Albums transforming culture in real time, innovation cascading from innovation. But innovation rarely blooms in calm conditions, and the documentary refrains from lingering on the tension that fueled it. Early on, Lennon and McCartney were a united front, co-architects of a new era. But collaboration naturally evolves, and by the mid-60s, artistic philosophies diverged. McCartney sought structure, polish, orchestral sophistication. Lennon leaned toward raw emotion, abstraction, experiment. The push-pull drove genius, but also strain. Creative disagreement isn't betrayal, it's the nature of ambition, but Anthology treats it with diplomatic courtesy. And George Harrison? His growth was astronomical, from supporting guitarist to visionary songwriter. Yet his frustrations appear only in gentle ripples in the documentary, quiet comments, polite chuckles. The real story was heavier, years of offering songs and receiving resistance, watching two giants command attention while his work simmered in the background. That doesn't diminish Lennon or McCartney. It humanizes the dynamic. Success isn't a fairy tale. It's negotiation, pride, compromise, and sometimes silent resentment. George Martin receives respectful praise in Anthology. He deserves it. But his presence also symbolized discipline many times at odds with band instincts. The relationship wasn't always serene. It didn't need to be. But acknowledging tension doesn't tarnish legacy. It clarifies the cost of brilliance. Anthology frames this era as creative paradise. In truth, it was creative combat sometimes, beautiful and bruising at once. And as the music grew more expansive, another force entered the story, one the anthology cushions. The era's intoxicating experimentation didn't just inspire, it destabilized. Colorful lights, sitar chords, spiritual quests. The image of enlightened artists opening their minds to new dimensions. Anthology leans into the beauty of this transformation. But the late 60s didn't radiate clarity alone. They flickered with confusion, risk, and emotional volatility. Experimentation didn't stay symbolic or casual. Psychedelics weren't simply tools of creativity. They were gateways that tested boundaries of perception, judgment, and trust. And while the era birthed masterpieces, it also magnified insecurities and blurred communication. The world applauded innovation. The band navigated altered ground beneath their feet. Social circles changed. Trust was tested. External figures influenced spiritual direction, emotional states, and interpersonal dynamics. The India trip, portrayed in Anthology as reflective and enlightening, also carried whispers of disappointment, doubt, and disillusionment. Enlightenment doesn't always arrive cleanly. Sometimes it leaves questions sharper than revelations. Tour life had already pushed them to physical strain. Now the pursuit of transcendence added a new dimension: emotional vulnerability. The anthology avoids the darker footnotes, the reliance on new substances to cope, the growing distance between band members as personal journeys diverged. The psychedelic phase wasn't a peaceful meditation retreat. It was a volatile period where creativity soared while unity thinned. Beautiful chaos, yes, but chaos nonetheless. And as that cosmic dust settled, something else rose: a new seriousness, a desire to reclaim control, and the emergence of forces outside the band that would test loyalty and structure more than any screaming stadium ever could. Anthology treats the breakup like a slow, bittersweet fade, artists evolving, paths diverging, but endings that change history rarely arrive gently. The Beatles' breakup wasn't quiet dissolution. It was friction layered over years, ignited by business turmoil as much as emotion. Apple Corps, the dream enterprise, became a maze of financial confusion. Decisions carried weight, measured not only in art, but in millions. Loyalties fractured under practical strain, lawyers entered, trust frayed. The documentary acknowledges business troubles, but cushions the despair and frustration behind them. Songwriting credit tensions sharpen. Personal relationships outside the band influence directions. And while Anthology avoids blame, the truth is less diplomatic. Words were exchanged that cut deep. Lines were drawn. Announcements were timed strategically. It wasn't just drift, it was conflict. George Harrison's departure, brief but significant, appears lightly in Anthology. But walking out of the world's most influential band signals pressure past breaking point. Lennon's exit wasn't a gentle whisper either. It arrived with finality. Paul's public reveal added sting. These weren't passive transitions, they were emotional ruptures. Anthology gives the band dignity, and that's fair. But it also spares viewers the raw turmoil. The breakup wasn't graceful, it was necessary and painful. And acknowledging that doesn't tarnish legacy, it honors honesty. Because when a force this powerful collapses, it doesn't vanish quietly. It shatters, and pieces take years to settle. Post-Beatles life in Anthology feels like reflection and reconciliation. But that tidy closure glosses over years of emotional distance, competitive tension, and unspoken hurt. Public statements sometimes carried bite. Lyrics echoed private frustration. Careers unfolded not in harmony, but parallel lines occasionally crossing with warmth, and sometimes coldness. There were resentments about credits, directions, and history itself. Friendship never died, but it wasn't constant. Time didn't immediately soften wounds. It thinned them slowly, unevenly. Only after years, tragedies, and perspective did the narrative settle into peace. Anthology compresses that timeline into something simpler, safer, easier to hold. Even reunion moments, while heartfelt, arrive through complexity. Nostalgia coexisted with memory, joy with regret. That's not failure, it's humanity. And the documentary, intentionally or not, trades some truth for mythic closure. The Beatles didn't end as a fairy tale, they ended as people, brilliant, flawed, aging, reflective, still bonded by something no audience can fully name, but separated by all they lived through. And perhaps the greatest disservice isn't omission, but that the full, complicated truth would have made the legacy even more powerful. The anthology didn't lie. It protected. It honored. It remembered through the emotions of those who lived it. But memory isn't history, and legends rarely write their own stories without polishing corners. What did it soften? The grit of beginnings, the psychological strain of fame, the creative rivalries that sharpen genius, the chaos beneath experimentation, the real fracture, not the poetic version, the long, uneven road to reconciliation. Knowing this doesn't diminish the Beatles, it elevates them. Because the real miracle isn't that four perfect figures made perfect music, it's that flawed humans, under impossible pressure, created something immortal anyway. The anthology gave us the myth. The truth is even more compelling, a story not only of brilliance, but of cost. And sometimes, the shadows illuminate greatness more clearly than the spotlight ever could.